that's where I want to go with the Hollywood stuff, and thinking about, when I was saying people starting through COVID, looking at the world around them differently, especially movies, and people start talking about predictive programming all of a sudden, and being like, "Wow, this was said in this movie before this happened." Da 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 da.
Yeah.
And you write about a lot of this symbolism and stuff. First, you're watching a lot of old movies, and you're seeing a lot of new movies. I don't know how new, or if you are these days. Are you seeing a lot of that same stuff play out in newer movies? If you're watching newer movies, when it comes to occult symbolism or any type of, obviously, agenda, we see that all over the place, but like weird symbolism still being placed in these movies?
Yeah, every now and then. I mean, I still do watch new productions. It's just that on the average, there's not very many that are very appealing to me. So, I mean, the last one that I recall, we watched Long Legs. I thought that was a really well done horror movie. That had some pretty intense, satanic ritual abuse themes going on in that film. They utilized a lot of sigils that are, really used in the occult. So there's elements of that film that I thought were fascinating. I did a couple pretty deep dives on Dune. I mean, Dune is, of course, a newer remake of the David Lynch and the Frank Herbert novel. So it's not new, but it's relatively new. That one stood out as having a lot of relevance, not just for like esoteric and occult type stuff, but also for geopolitics. There are new films that do pop up here and there that we do good deep dives on when they're there.
Right.
It's just that there's not. It seems to be more rare because what happens, I think, when the stories and the narratives become all about the woke stuff, everything else gets kind of pushed to the side. So that's all they care about, is just pushing the woke,
the big agenda.
And so there's not going to be much concern with deep symbolic meaning or complex characters like that.
Are you seeing occult stuff in those older movies when you went back and watched stuff? Have you known like stuff you've researched? Are you seeing it there, or are you just seeing like America, propaganda?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You don't see a lot of symbolism in 30s and 40s movies. Every now and then there'll be one that stands out. And there's a couple old, like before the Hays Code, there was some pretty fascinating satanic cinema that came out that did have some interesting symbolic stuff. Some of the Fritz Lang material is pretty dark, pretty esoteric, you could say. Obviously Metropolis. We watched, I forget who directed Black Cat, but that's like an explicitly satanic movie from like 1919 or somewhere in there.
Right.
That one's pretty neat to watch, pretty famous cinema-wise. And then they have the Hays Code, which introduces really strict laws on what could and couldn't be shown on screen, because they were getting pretty wild pre-Hays Code with the movies and what they would say and what they could do. And then you see the switch to where like, it's like the opposite extreme, to where they're like, you can't show husband and wife having a bed. Like it's like they have to have separate beds.
Right.
So it's really bizarre, like levels of extreme opposites they flip to. But after the Hays Code, it seems to be, like you said, really focused on stories that tell pro-ally messages. I can only think of maybe one or two 40s era films that have, I think, what's the noir movie with Bogart and Lauren Bacall? That one has some interesting hints at sex cult, prawn stuff going on. I always get Glass Key and that one mixed up. I don't think it's Glass Key. It might be Glass Key, but that one comes to mind, and I think I put that in the second book. But you have in the 50s, you have this really wild Black Dahlia event occur, which does involve high level Hollywood people, presumably it seems, satanic ritual abuse, dismemberment, all of that, and that. So that there is this undercurrent going on amongst Hollywood people. People even thought G. Edward Robinson was connected to that. People believe that Orson Welles originally was connected to Black Dahlia case. None of that was substantiated, but that's what people were suspecting at the time. Anyway, so there is this undercurrent, but I don't think really the 50s are interesting, because you do see some symbolic, weird, darker stuff popping up. Hitchcock, I think, is a key figure because he's working with British propaganda and British intelligence to actually produce films. You do start to see a big shift into explicitly, one example, maybe not so much explicitly occult stuff, but there's definitely the theme of dissociation, multiple personality in a bunch of Hitchcock films.
For sure.
He's got a couple about false flags, 39 Steps.
Right.
I forget the other one about the guy that blows up the Allied
that walks with a bomb.
Plane factory. Yeah. There's a few of these.
Is Hitchcock being told, because I don't know much about the backstory. I know Hitchcock films. I don't know much about his backstory when it comes to the writing. Is he being told like, hey, we want you to put this in movies, or is this like are they finding a way to inspire him loosely to then write these scripts? How's that going down?
He seemed to work really closely with, he was a filmmaker for the British Ministry of Information. And so he was actually filming actual literal just war propaganda reels. And he was doing American films. So there's this really interesting connection between Hollywood and British intelligence. The other circles that are doing this is called the Korda Circle, a guy named Alexander Korda, who was working closely with British intelligence. And he was the more direct British intelligence link to a lot of Hollywood films at this time. But people at MGM, like they're already working with intelligence agencies. I think by the 1950s, by the 1950s, they're already like literally, the CIA is literally like consulting and having movies made. And in fact, the guy who was behind the what's called the Doctrinal Warfare Program, C.D. Jackson, he was also like consulting on movies, telling Hollywood like what to put in movies. Like I said, the OSS was basically doing a bunch of John Ford stuff. So yeah, it's like over time, like the connections grow, and then this sort of turns into this hive thing. And by the 60s, when you have the counterculture sparking, which I believe was actually engineered by the system, that's when you really start to see straight up satanic, straight up like occult, straight up like real symbolic stuff in film, which you don't really see prior to that.
Do you think that's the system doing that, or it's the system instigating that, or both? Like, is it the system believing in it, or like, are they being like, we just need to destroy this and destroy people's brains, so bring more of that in,
I think some of the malicious people maybe at a high level thought that they really needed to destroy people. But I think a lot of people, boomer era people in the 60s, thought, oh, we're really going to be liberated, bro. We're really going to, hey, man, we got just the free love, man. I think they really believed that they were achieving something. But when you look at the origins of the counterculture, it's very clearly, all psychonauts from the CIA. It's Tim Leary who bragged that the counterculture was all from the CIA. Esalen Institute, propped up by the establishment. It's the think tank of the New Age movement in the 60s counterculture. If you go into the history of British intelligence and Madame Blavatsky, she's the New Age before the New Age. Like, she's the one who really, through Theosophy, lays the groundwork back in her day for what decades later becomes the 60s counterculture. So can you describe Crowley as well? I think Crowley plays a key role in the counterculture. Can you describe? I can't. What's her last name? I can't. I'm Madame Blavatsky.
Who is? And can you describe her?
Yeah, she's a turn of the century occultist from Odessa who ended up in Britain, the UK for a while. Then she ends up in New York. She has this really wild story, and what happens is that she claims to be this very powerful medium, and she is for a time period working with something called is a very famous thing at the turn of the century, the Psychic Research Society in the UK. They're very prominent. This is when mesmerism and seances are really popular, right? 1890s, 1900, 1910. So she gets in with this group for a while, and she's gaining popularity. She writes a lot of books. She writes ISIS Unveiled. She writes The Secret Doctrine. And she says, it's time for a new religion. And so basically she does what a lot of cult leaders do. She does a buffet style approach where she puts together a bunch of stuff and comes up with her own new cult called Theosophy. and it's a mix of Kabbalah, Hermeticism, tantric stuff, Buddhism, elements of Christianity, Gnostic Christianity. She kind of puts it all into a hodgepodge, creates this new thing, which she thinks will be her cult. She falls out with the Psychic Research Society because they think she's a fraud. And so they get this guy, I forget his name, but he's like a British government connected person to investigate her, because she had been going to the Himalayas to receive messages from the ascended masters. Well, what the investigator comes to conclude is that she's a spy, and that her channeled messages are just her own, or that she was going to meet with a handler. So initially they suspect that she's KGB or Soviet, excuse me. KGB doesn't exist, but she's a Soviet, a Bolshevik spy, because she's meeting with and exchanging letters with the famous, eventually KGB guy, Rorik.
Okay.
Who is an occultist. And so they have this, so he's a Theosophist too. But what it looks like as things progress is that she wasn't a Russian spy, a Soviet spy, or a British spy. She was working for the Milner-Fabian elites, and she was kind of a go-between. And that the whole idea was that the future global order would have this pseudo-religion that she's creating. So she's supposed to be, I think, if you're familiar with the Milner-Fabian thesis and those circles of the Rothschilds and others, she's supposed to kind of be the future religion that they want to have for the world. So the global government needs a global religion. So
great.
That's her crazy story. She Crowley was a big fan of her. Crowley actually made people coming into the, I can't remember if it was his AA or the OTO, but he made people read like 2 or 3 of her books as part of the reading list to join the Lima or whatever.
Do you see that influence today in a lot of celebrities or elites at all?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I just read the Cambridge Companion to Western Hermeticism and Esotericism, and the entry on Blavatsky notes that like all the Instagram yoga chicks, like you couldn't have that without Madame Blavatsky. Like that would, she basically yogaized.
It's like a Lululemon cult.
Yeah, it's all from her.
Great.
Absolutely.
Great. That's
and by extension, like her and Crowley and others, Gurdjieff, like there's a lot of these characters, but you get the 60s boomer counterculture from these people writing in the 20s, 30s, 40s, right? Huxley, he plays a big role too in the counterculture because he was pushing, doing all the hallucinogens way before the CIA was.
For sure. It seems like there's no quote unquote counterculture that's safe from any of these elite types, because they go in and hijack it and always twist it. Whether it's, I think we've talked, I don't know if you've talked about it. I've talked about on the show, like modern art being kind of co-opted, or you talk about the counterculture. And you think of all these figures throughout time that people see as the counterculture, but they're either CIA adjacent or CIA, and it's hard to know anything anymore. And there's some people who just write it all off. But it's like I do like a lot of that art. I can't help. There's some art I just like, and I don't know if those artists even knew that they were CIA. I think maybe the CIA was funding their art to inflate the prices and whatnot, and make it look a certain way. But it's like nothing's safe.
During the Cold War, they created the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and the Frances Stoner Saunders is an academic. She has a famous book on this, and that was an entity that nobody knew was the CIA, but it was the CIA that was funding a lot of the artists that you're talking about. So people like Andy Warhol, Jackson Pollock. I mean, even classical musicians. It wasn't just like abstract. So it was all kinds of poets and writers and authors and this was not just to say like Malcolm Muggeridge of the MI6. They had similar projects where they were setting up people to basically enlist anyone in culture war against the Soviets, because the Soviets had a philosophy of cosmism and realism, and what the CIA did to, again, back up your point. I mean, they actually went and recruited and worked with French deconstructionists. Like they're actually going to like Derrida and saying, we're the CIA, we're going to work with you, we're going to promote you, because anything anti-objective, anti-real, whether it's literature, visual arts, is all part of cultural war against the Soviets.
Well, as someone who survived college, sort of mentally, and then was a professor for some times. I mean, the Derrida, you just kind of triggered an old part of my brain, like that. He was such a major part of colleges, and back then I wasn't thinking about. Back then, when I was a student, I was not thinking about Marxism or deconstruction. You know, how it's going to affect the future and my peers and myself. But it's like the bedrock of college now. You know, you break down everything down to your own essence, and we destroy you that way. We think
there's no narratives. Everything is, your own personal narrative. You can't know the author's meaning. I mean, it's all kind of crazy.
It's crazy.
I mean, by the way, if I can't know the author's meaning, then the guy telling me in the deconstructionist books that I can't know the author's meaning, I can't know the deconstructionist. So it's self-refuting, it's self-defeating, but I have to be honest, like, this was stuff I got into years ago in undergrad and grad school. I was surprised to see, like, when I first read about the CIA going to talk to deconstructionists, I'm like, why would they go and talk to deconstruction? Now it's like, well, of course they would. But when I first read that, it just kind of blew my mind. My mind melted. Like, I thought we were fighting the libs in the Cold War. No. There was a great article that somebody on some foreign policy thing put out last year, I think, and it was like the CIA was never right. The CIA was anti-Soviet, but never right-wing. And I thought that was a really accurate description, because we think of the Cold War people. Now, maybe some people in the Cold War were, right-wingers or whatever, but the CIA was always very amenable to anything postmodern, anything Fabian socialist. So they didn't like Stalin, but that didn't mean they didn't like other forms of socialism. Right.
It's just because you disagree with these people or you agree with these people doesn't mean you should trust them. And it seems like it's always been a tool to just destroy you. In your book, when I was looking through, I saw that you wrote about Westworld. And I was curious what your thoughts on that, because I think about that show a lot lately. I don't know if you wrote about the show or not, honestly. It could have been, I guess, the book. But I think about the show because when I'm talking to the people who are in their silos of their little truth, I think about the robots in Westworld and how they couldn't see the door, right? And I'm like, every time I'm talking to people, I'm like, oh, they can't see the door.
Oh, yeah.
What were you thinking about Westworld? Why was that important to you?
I remember I wrote that chapter. It was right after season 1 had happened, and I really liked season 1. I kind of lost interest by about season 3.
Same.
So I never did finish Westworld. I mean, I didn't hate the show. I just kind of lost interest, got busy with other stuff. But I remember season 1 really impressed me, and I thought that the way they updated this old Michael Crichton story, and I grew up watching in the 80s the original movie version from the 70s. I think there's 3 of those. There's 1 or 2 sequels, but the 70s ones are kind of cheesy because it's like Yul Brynner's the robot.
Right.
But the TV show was interesting because it was done by Nolan's brother, wasn't it? Right. Jonathan Nolan.
Yeah, that's right.
And I remember it having a lot to do with manipulation of archetypes, and I saw it as kind of a neo-Gnostic narrative. I forgot that thing about the doors that you're talking about. But that was 2017 was pretty, we didn't know for sure that they were going to roll out SEX bots and like where we're going now and like what all the AI that's rolled out in the last couple of years. So I felt like that was going to be a very predictive programmy type of show. I think it was.
Oh, I agree. I thought The Leftovers was, I bring up The Leftovers a lot as in I love that show, but it was a world that looking back became the world we inherited post-COVID. Our lockdowns was their rapture event. But then I saw you were writing about Westworld. I'm like, man, Westworld really spoke a lot to the world we're inheriting right now too.